feel slightly like an intruder, being one of the few members, representative of governments present, but it's very interesting and it's a learning experience for me as well. So 5 minutes is not a long time. I'll try to speak to some issues and some trade-offs in the negotiation. I've been following this for the last year and a half, more or less, both the SDGs and the FFD from New York. So I think first maybe a comment on the structure of the outcome document. So there's a discussion, because the title of this presentation is what is left to play or to deal with. So I think there's a structure of the document, and there's a discussion as to how much, whether it should stay respectful of the Monterrey-Doha structure, whether it should be a document that speaks directly to the new set of sustainable development goals in the post-2015 development agenda, so something that is designed specifically to support that other new process for the next 15 years, whether it's some kind of a hybrid. And I think so far with the zero draft, which for me it's still not close to the end game. I think it's a first initial document, still requires a lot of revision and working with. It maybe started off more along the lines of a hybrid, so it doesn't really respect the Monterrey-Doha structure, and it kind of changed it around to a certain degree in a negative way, because it made room for this large section highlighting the critical role of the private sector as the new thing in financing force development. So that's a bit of an issue. Then we come to the issue, does financing for development remain financing for development, or does it become financing for sustainable development? So how do you introduce the sustainability element into the FFD process? And there's a wide variety of positions here. As far as Brazil is concerned, I think we wouldn't like to sort of kill the identity of the process as such, but I think it would make sense to introduce the sustainability element, in particular if we do it on the basis of the Rio +20 consensus and of the SDG 17 goals, which we find very interesting because they reinforce the social inclusion aspects of development alongside environmental sustainability and a fair and more just type of economic growth and development. So all these things are very positive. We like them, and we think that they should be introduced into the world of financing. So even people from finance ministers, they should read the 17 goals and be cognizant of the goals. So we have to sort of contaminate the FFD agenda with sustainable development. And this could be a sort of a mutually beneficial initiative for both tracks. Then it divides, it sort of splits the financing into different types, national, international, public-private. The national, it has this strong emphasis on national mobilization of resources. It's funny because in the World Bank they speak of national mobilization of revenue, but it's not exactly the same thing. On the other hand, there's a lengthy, a lot of text on tax, increasing the tax base. I think that's a positive development if we consider from the perspective of the last 10, 20, 30 years. So I think this is a positive development coming from extreme Washington consensus type policies of the past that today even developed countries accept that development requires national sources of income through taxation. So the idea of expanding the taxation base, I think, is a very positive development. Alongside other more sort of negative agenda type issues which need to be dealt with, corruption, illegal financial flows, so on and so forth. So here, I think the only comment I would have is that Monterrey introduced the concept that countries are themselves primarily responsible for their own development, which is good because the international community can sort of wash their hands and say, okay, if you're not developing, you're not doing a good job, you don't have the right policies, you don't have a good government, and you don't have the rule of law that is required to develop. But if that's the case, then we need to introduce a narrative about policy space, because if governments become responsible for their own development, then they need the policy space to take destiny into their own hands. They cannot then discover that the policies that lead to development, the real ones, no longer are available to them because they have subscribed to a series of treaties internationally that prevent them from taking these policies. International public financing is a huge chapter. It's supposed to speak of ODA. It doesn't do so to any great extent, really. There's no additionality of commitments here. The donors are very shy. They claim that ODA now is a drop in the ocean because the new agenda is so vast, and it's universal. It's for everybody, not just for developing countries. So not a lot of ODA here. No new commitments. Multilateral development banks are trying to find a role for themselves in this new reality. We have a paper from billion to trillions in the World Bank, and I think in this search for a new role, they have discovered that perhaps they could be mediators of capital from the international global financial market to underserved regions of the developing world, and they figured that that's a market of $5 trillion. So perhaps they can make some money off of it by being lenders directly to poor, underserved takers in developing countries. I'm not sure whether that's a good idea. Then private sector becomes a chapter all its own, and there's no line between national and international. So national international is there's borders only for public money, but for private money, there's no longer any borders. There's no nationality. So they have a chapter that's both international, national, regional, whatever. It's just private. And I think this is not interesting as such because there's private domestic sector, there's small business, there's SMEs. Private can mean a lot of things. It's not just large multinational corporations. It's not just global banks. So I think that's sort of a bad decision. Again, it also does not establish a difference between private, meaning an individual's money or asset or his own wage, and private in terms of private corporations, institutions. It's all private. So they speak of remittances, for example, as a source of financing for sustainable development. And we understand that remittances, it's money, hard-earned money by migrants who work under very dire and sometimes exploitative circumstances abroad, without any workers' rights, being exploited, and their hard-earned money they remit back to their own families, and I don't think we should touch that money and start making plans for it in terms of, oh, let's use this money for sustainable development. So here I think we have to be careful about these narratives. I think for the private sector, if the emphasis is to remain, then there's obviously another dimension which is lacking, which is creating a framework of accountability for the private sector taking a larger role in terms of financing for development. So nobody wants to talk about that, but I think that's the sort of counterweight to greater role for the private sector, because we do not wish to entirely outsource governance of public issues to private hands. I think governments are still important. They are elected. Corporate boards are not elected by the people, and often they don't even live in the countries that they work with. So I think this is an issue that has a lot of consequences. Some general comments. I think the text still doesn't capture the post-2008 crisis reality. It's far from that. Whereas I think the 17 goals are kind of forward-looking. They're new, they're novel, they're universal, they have a lot of new things. They have inequality, which I think is the great asset of the set of goals, inequality. That one was hard to achieve, and if you reopen, that's the first one that will go. But then, you know, on the financing side, it's still a very oldish, backward-looking kind of narrative. It doesn't capture the new reality of how even the developed world reacted to the 2008 crisis by adopting a very interventionist sort of attitude towards saving the risk takers, private sectors, GM. Everybody was saved and bailed out with taxpayer money. That's not the kind of policy recommendations they usually make for developing countries. Again, I think I have to cut my intervention short because so much to say and so little time, but just Finally, I think a small comment on process and institutional setup. I think process is important. The follow-up issue is still quite hotly debated. It is a general G77 position that FFD needs its own follow-up, and it never got one. So the idea of a commission, on a permanent commission for following up on the FFD outcome declaration and commitments, if we ever have interesting commitments. Again, I'm not especially optimistic that this will fly. I think there's a lot of talk about integrating the FFD follow-up with the SDG follow-up under this new HLPF mechanism. Of course, the HLPF mechanism, as it now stands, only meets 9 days a year, so that's not much of a follow-up. If it were to take that job and to do it properly, it would require some kind of understanding or agreement as to a real supporting structure for it that could make it work every day of the year. And that could lead it to have these subgroups, working groups, and to have be in a position to implement a real agenda within the, it has both an ECOSOC sort of framework and also the General Assembly universal membership framework. So those two issues, I think the tax committee is a big deliverable if we can have an agreement on more than upgrading it, maybe making it universal and intergovernmental. I think those are the two elements that the developing country really want, and I think that would be up to the level of the new narrative that countries are primarily responsible for their own development, and they need to mobilize national resources for that on the basis of increasing their revenue base. So then you need a committee that would discuss this seriously internationally in the multilateral setup. Thank you.